What would you do if you saw a tiny baby lion crying in the middle of the African savanna, clutching a torn piece of cloth, like it was the last thing keeping him alive? At first, people thought the cub was just scared or lost. But every time someone tried to take the cloth away, he growled, pulled it tighter to his chest, and refused to let go. Rangers soon realized this wasn't just a random piece of fabric. When they finally discovered where that cloth came from, the truth revealed a story of loss, courage, and a sacrifice no one expected. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And what they uncovered would change the way everyone understood that small, trembling cub. The sun stood almost perfectly overhead, above the vast savanna near the edge of Tsavo National Park. Heat shimmered above the long stretch of red dirt road, turning the air into a wavering haze that danced just above the ground. Dry grass whispered under the slow push of a hot wind, and thin clouds of dust clung to the tires of a small convoy of safari vehicles making their way through the open plain. Scattered acacia trees dotted the landscape, their flat canopies casting small islands of shade across the endless gold. Inside the first vehicle, the driver suddenly eased off the accelerator. "Wait, hold on," he muttered, squinting through the windshield. A small shape stood in the middle of the road ahead. The vehicle rolled to a slow stop. Behind it, the other safari trucks braked one by one, their engines idling quietly as passengers leaned toward the windows to see what had caused the delay. "What is that?" someone asked. At first, it looked like a bundle of tangled grass or a small animal frozen in place. But as the vehicles edged closer, the shape lifted its head. It was a baby lion. The cub stood alone on the red dirt road, its small body thin and dusty, its fur matted and dull under the harsh African sun. Even from a distance, it was clear the cub was not in good condition. Its ribs pressed faintly against its skin, and its legs trembled slightly as it shifted its weight. Normally, a lion cub would have run the moment the engines approached. But this one didn't move. It just stood there staring. The cub's eyes were wide and glassy, as though something terrible had happened, and it still hadn't understood it. The wind tugged lightly at its scruffy fur, but the animal barely reacted. Inside the safari trucks, tourists leaned out with cameras. "Is it alone?" a woman whispered. "That's not normal," another man said quietly. Lion cubs were rarely seen by themselves in open areas like this. Where there was a cub, there was almost always a mother somewhere nearby. And yet the surrounding savanna lay silent, stretching empty toward the horizon. The cub let out a small sound. Not a roar, a cry. It was a thin, trembling sound that carried strangely across the still afternoon air. Then someone noticed something else. "Wait. Look at its mouth," a tourist said. The cub was holding something. Clenched tightly between its teeth was a torn piece of dark cloth. The fabric hung loosely from its mouth, stained with dirt and faded patches of old blood. Every now and then, the cub adjusted its grip, biting down harder, as if afraid it might drop it. A man in the second vehicle slowly opened his door. "I just want a closer look," he said. The moment his foot touched the ground, the cub reacted instantly. It let out a low, trembling growl. The sound was small, but filled with warning. The cub backed up slightly, pulling the cloth tighter against its chest. It crouched low and pressed both of its front paws over the fabric as though shielding it from the world. The man froze. Okay, he murmured, raising his hands. The cub's ears flattened against its head. Its growl faded into a weak rumble, but its eyes never left the stranger. It wasn't the reaction of an animal preparing to attack. It was the reaction of an animal that had already lost too much. The hot wind swept across the road again, lifting the corner of the cloth slightly. The moment it moved, the cub snapped its jaws tighter around it, pulling the fabric closer to its chest. Inside the vehicles, cameras began clicking. Several tourists lifted their phones to record the strange scene. "Poor thing," a woman whispered. "Maybe it's lost," someone suggested. "Or its mother's nearby," another voice said nervously. But no one dared walk any closer. Even a cub could be dangerous if it felt cornered. The safari guide sitting in the driver's seat studied the animal carefully. Something about the cub's behavior didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just frightened. It was protecting something. He reached for the radio clipped to the dashboard. "Tsavo Ranger Station, this is Safari Guide Vehicle 3, he said calmly. "We've got a lion cub alone on the southern road near the Acacia Flats. Behavior is unusual, possibly injured." Static crackled through the speaker. "Copy that," a voice responded. "Stand by." A few kilometers away, Ranger Kido Mwangi was finishing a routine patrol along the park boundary when the call came through his radio. He slowed his vehicle. "A cub alone," he repeated. "That's correct," the guide answered. "Looks weak and it's holding something." Kido frowned slightly. Lion cubs rarely stayed in open roads unless something had gone terribly wrong. "I'm on my way," he said. He turned the steering wheel sharply, sending the patrol truck back toward the safari route. Dust rose behind him as the vehicle accelerated across the Savannah road. As he drove, his mind ran through possibilities. A separated cub, a wounded cub, or worse, a mother that hadn't survived. When Kido finally reached the location, the line of safari vehicles parted to let his truck through. He stepped out slowly. "Everyone stay in your vehicles," he called calmly. The tourists fell silent as he walked forward. The cub still stood in the middle of the road. Now that Kido was closer, the details became clearer. The cub was thinner than he'd first realized. Its shoulders were narrow, its legs weak. Beneath the dusty coat, its ribs showed clearly. Dehydration, exhaustion. And yet the moment the cub saw him approaching, it shifted again. The small lion crouched lower over the cloth, dragging it closer under its chest. Its eyes followed Kido's every step. Kido stopped a few meters away and slowly knelt down to make himself appear smaller. "Easy there," he said quietly. The cub responded with another low growl. Each time Kido moved a step closer, the cub pulled the cloth tighter against its body. Its small paws clutched the fabric as if someone might rip it away at any moment. But what struck Kido most was not the aggression. It was the fear. The cub's eyes weren't filled with anger. They were filled with something far more desperate. Something that looked like loss. Kido reached back toward his vehicle without breaking eye contact. "Net," he said quietly. One of the safari guides handed him the rescue net. Kido rose slowly and began moving forward again. The cub tried to stand fully this time, perhaps thinking about running. But its hind legs trembled violently beneath it. After 2 shaky steps, the cub nearly collapsed. Instead of fleeing, it wrapped the cloth around its front paws and bit down hard, like a child refusing to let go of a precious toy. Kido moved quickly. The net dropped over the cub in one smooth motion. The animal struggled weakly for a few seconds, letting out a thin cry, but it had no strength left for a real fight. Within moments, it lay still beneath the mesh. Even then, its jaws remained clamped around the cloth. Kido gently lifted the cub net and all. The small lion barely moved, but the cloth never slipped from its mouth. He carried the cub to the patrol vehicle and placed it carefully into a transport crate. The tourists watched in complete silence. For a moment, the vast savannah felt strangely quiet. Then the ranger truck door slammed shut. The vehicle pulled away, carrying the small, trembling lion cub with it. Back at the Tsavo ranger station, word of the rescue had already reached the small veterinary room. Dr. Amina Njoroge stood waiting beside the examination table. When Kido carried the crate inside, she immediately noticed the cub's condition. "Let's get him out," she said. Kido carefully opened the crate. The cub was lifted onto the table, its dusty paws sliding slightly across the metal surface. Amina began examining him right away. His breathing was fast and shallow. His body temperature was elevated from hours spent under the brutal sun. "He's badly dehydrated," she said. Kido nodded. But Amina quickly noticed something else. The cub still hadn't released the cloth. Even when she gently tried to check his injured paw, the cub dragged the fabric back beneath its chest. "Hey, easy," she murmured softly. The cub let out a faint growl and pulled the cloth tighter. "All right," Amina sighed. "Let's see what this is." Slowly, she reached forward and loosened the fabric from the cub's mouth. For the first time since the rescue, the cloth came free. She unfolded it carefully. The material was rough and dark, worn thin in places. Dirt and dried blood stained the surface. Amina lifted it closer to her face. Then she paused. "There's milk on this," she said quietly. Kido looked up. "Lioness milk," she added. He stepped closer. There were also claw marks torn across the fabric. Large claw marks, not from the cub. Amina and Kido exchanged a look. Kido took the cloth from her hands and turned it over slowly. He studied the stitching along the edges, the fabric, the pattern. Something about it was familiar. After a moment, he spoke softly. "This isn't random cloth." Amina frowned. "What do you mean?" Kido ran his thumb along the seam. "This looks like part of a ranger scarf." The room fell completely silent. Amina stared at the cloth again. If Kido was right, then the cub hadn't been guarding just any piece of fabric. It had been guarding something that belonged to someone. And suddenly the mystery surrounding the crying baby lion felt far more serious than either of them had expected. Where did that torn piece of cloth come from, and why was the tiny lion cub holding onto it like his life depended on it? What do you think the cloth meant to him? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we move into the most powerful part of the story. Late that afternoon, the heat over the Tsavo savanna had begun to soften slightly, though the air still carried the dry weight of the day. The wind moved lazily through the scattered acacia trees, pushing waves through the tall yellow grass and lifting thin curls of red dust into the air. Inside the ranger station, the torn piece of cloth lay on a small metal table. Kido Mwangi stood beside it, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the fabric. Across from him, Dr. Amina Njoroge finished rinsing her hands and stepped closer. So she said quietly, "You think it belonged to a ranger?" Kido nodded slowly. "I'm almost certain of it." Amina picked the cloth up again, examining the stitching along the edge. "The material matches," she admitted. "But we still don't know how the cub got it." Kido looked toward the window, where the sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon. "There's only one way to find out." Amina raised an eyebrow. "You want to go back out there?" "Yes." He reached for the cloth and folded it carefully. Wherever this came from, it didn't happen on that road. Something happened deeper in the savanna. Amina hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Then we should find it before nightfall." Within minutes, they were back in the patrol vehicle, the cloth sealed inside a small evidence bag between them. The engine rumbled as Kido steered the truck back toward the southern safari road. The savanna stretched wide and quiet beneath the fading afternoon sun. The air smelled of dry soil and sunburned grass. Acacia trees stood scattered across the land like silent watchers. Kido slowed the truck as they approached the stretch of road where the cub had been found earlier that day. "There," Amina said softly. The place looked almost ordinary now. Just another empty section of dirt road cutting through endless grass. Kido parked and shut off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Kido opened the door. "Let's see what we can find." They stepped down onto the warm, red earth. The ground was covered in a thin layer of dust that preserved tracks clearly. Kido crouched almost immediately. "Here," Amina joined him. Small paw prints marked the surface of the road, the cub's tracks. "They lead off the road," Kido said. The prints moved unevenly, dragging slightly in places as if the cub had been stumbling. Amina followed them with her eyes. Then she noticed something else. "Blood," she murmured. Small dark stains dotted the dust beside the tracks. Not much, but enough. Kido brushed away a layer of loose dirt with the side of his hand. The trail became clearer. The paw prints led away from the road and into the tall grass. He stood. "Let's follow it." They moved slowly into the savanna. The grass brushed against their legs as they walked. The sun cast long shadows across the land, and the air hummed with the distant buzz of insects. Every few steps the tracks appeared again, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, but always leading deeper toward a small cluster of acacia trees several hundred meters away. Kido's pace slowed as they approached the trees. The ground here looked different, disturbed. Grass was flattened in several places, and the red earth had been churned into rough patches. Amina stopped beside a trampled bush. "This didn't happen naturally," she said. Kido nodded grimly. Then something metallic caught the sunlight. He bent down and picked it up. A shell casing. The brass cylinder gleamed faintly in his hand. Amina's face tightened. Gunfire. Kido turned the casing slowly between his fingers. Then he noticed another, and another. Several more lay scattered across the ground. He exhaled slowly. Poachers. Amina scanned the area. "Look at the tire tracks. A set of deep grooves cut through the dirt nearby." "These aren't safari vehicles," she said. Kido walked closer to inspect them. The tire marks curved sharply in the soil, forming a wide arc. "Someone turned around here," he said. "Fast." The marks were deeper on one side, suggesting the driver had spun the vehicle quickly. Dust had settled over them, but the pattern was still visible. The entire area felt heavy with the remains of chaos. Kido stood still for several seconds. Then his eyes moved toward a series of larger tracks in the dirt. Lion tracks. He knelt beside them. "These belong to an adult lioness," he said quietly. The paw prints were wide and deeply pressed into the ground, but they didn't move calmly across the savanna. They were scattered, erratic, signs of struggle. Amina followed the direction of the tracks. "They go that way." Beyond the acacia trees, the tall grass opened into a patch of dry clearing. Kido rose slowly. "Stay close," he said. They walked forward cautiously. The air felt strangely still as they passed the trees. Then they saw it, a shape lying in the grass ahead, large, golden, unmoving. Kido stopped. For a moment neither of them spoke, then he walked forward. The lioness lay on her side in the middle of the clearing. Her golden fur was coated with red dust dull in the fading sunlight. Dark stains spread across her flank where blood had dried into the coat. Amina crouched beside the animal. Kido stood just behind her. Several bullet wounds were visible along the lioness's ribs and shoulder. "These were gunshots," Amina said quietly. Kido nodded. The wounds told a brutal story. The lioness had fought. The surrounding grass was flattened in several places, and deep claw marks scored the soil where she had struggled. But the fight had not ended in her favor. Amina gently touched the lioness's fur. The body was stiff. "She's been dead for at least 3 days," she said. 3 days. Exactly the amount of time since Ranger Daniel had disappeared. The wind moved softly across the clearing. For a moment, the savanna seemed to hold its breath. Then Kido noticed something lying several meters away, near a patch of dry grass, a piece of fabric. He walked toward it slowly. When he picked it up, a thin layer of dust fell away. It was a scarf, dark green, the same color worn by Tsavo Rangers. The fabric was torn along one edge. Blood stained the surface, and deep claw marks cut through the threads. Amina stepped closer. "What is it?" Kido turned the scarf in his hands. Amina's eyes narrowed as she examined the stitching. Then she inhaled sharply. "That's Daniel's." Kido looked up. "You're sure Amina pointed to the corner of the fabric?" "There's a stitched line here," she said. "Daniel always repaired his scarf like that. I remember it from last year." Silence settled over them. Daniel had vanished during an anti-poaching patrol 3 days earlier. Search teams had found no sign of him. Until now. Kido stared at the torn scarf. Then he looked back at the lioness's body. Pieces of the story began falling into place in his mind. "Daniel must have encountered the poachers here," he said slowly. Amina nodded, and the lioness was already wounded. Kido studied the bullet marks again. "The poachers shot her," he continued. "Daniel probably arrived during the attack." He turned the scarf over. "There's lion blood on this." Amina understood immediately. "You think he tried to help her?" Kido nodded. He might have used the scarf to bandage the wound. The image formed clearly in both of their minds. A ranger kneeling beside a wounded lioness. Gunshots echoing through the trees. Chaos, fear, and somewhere nearby, a tiny cub watching everything. Amina looked out across the savanna. "That cub must have been here," she said softly. Kido followed her gaze. The cub had probably stayed beside its mother after the shooting stopped. Too small to understand what had happened. Too frightened to leave. Days alone beside the body. Until hunger and thirst forced it to wander away. "In the cloth," Amina whispered. Kido held up the torn scarf. "The cub must have taken a piece of it," he said. "The last thing that smelled like its mother. And the man who tried to save her." The savanna wind stirred the dry grass around them. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then Kido folded the scarf carefully. "We need to report this," he said. Amina nodded. "And we need to get back to the cub." By the time they returned to the ranger station, the sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon. The sky glowed deep orange over the savanna. Inside the small recovery room, the cub lay curled in the corner of the enclosure. One of the staff members met them at the door. "You should see this," she said quietly. Kido stepped closer to the enclosure. The cub had not moved much since they had left. It lay tightly curled around the torn piece of cloth, pressing it against its chest with both paws. A small dish of food sat untouched nearby. "He hasn't eaten," the staff member said, "or drunk water." The cub let out a faint broken whimper. The sound barely rose above the quiet hum of the room. Amina's expression darkened. "That's not good." She stepped closer to the enclosure and crouched down. The cub lifted its head weakly. Its eyes were dull with exhaustion. But when Amina reached toward the cloth, the cub immediately pulled it closer and let out a weak growl. Not an attack. Just fear. He thinks we're going to take it, Amina said softly. Kido nodded. The cub's entire body seemed wrapped around the fabric, as if losing it would mean losing everything. Amina checked the cub's pulse gently through the bars of the enclosure. Her face grew serious. Kido, she said quietly. What is it? His heart rate is too high. She looked up. Stress like this can kill an animal his size. Kido felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. If he doesn't eat, Amina continued, he may not survive the night. The words hung heavily in the air. The cub whimpered again and pressed its face into the cloth. Kido watched for several seconds. Then he pulled a chair across the floor and placed it beside the enclosure. What are you doing? Amina asked. Waiting. He sat down slowly. I'm not going to force him. Amina studied him for a moment. Then she nodded quietly. The room gradually grew darker as night settled over the savanna. Kido remained seated beside the enclosure. He didn't try to touch the cub. He didn't try to take the cloth. He simply sat there. After several minutes, he spoke. His voice was low and calm. You know, he said softly, I lost a dog once. The cub shifted slightly, but did not growl. Kido kept speaking. I used to sit beside his bed every night after he got sick. He rested his hands on his knees. I didn't know if he understood me, but it felt better to talk. The cub's breathing slowed slightly. Kido continued quietly. So, I'll sit here with you too. Outside the ranger station, the African night stretched wide and silent across the savanna. Inside the small room, a ranger and a frightened lion cub began the slow, fragile work of building trust. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the small windows of the veterinary room, the atmosphere felt different. The sharp edge of fear that had filled the enclosure the night before had softened. The cub still lay beside the cloth, but it was no longer gripping it desperately with its teeth. Its breathing was slower. Kido rubbed his tired eyes and stood slowly from the chair. His back ached from sitting in the same position for hours, but he ignored it. Morning, little one, he murmured quietly. The cub lifted its head. Its eyes were still wary, but there was less panic in them now. Kido stepped away briefly and returned with a small metal dish of water and several small strips of fresh meat prepared by the station staff. He opened the outer gate of the enclosure carefully and slid the dishes just inside the corner. Then he stepped back again, giving the cub plenty of space. I'm not going to rush you, he said softly. The cub watched him carefully. For several minutes, nothing happened. The little lion remained curled beside the cloth, its eyes flicking between Kido and the food. Then slowly, cautiously, the cub rose. Its legs trembled slightly from weakness as it took one hesitant step forward. Then another. The cub paused halfway to the bowl, lowering its nose toward the meat. It sniffed cautiously, as though the scent itself might be dangerous. Kido remained perfectly still in his chair. The cub glanced up at him once more. Kido gave a small nod. It's okay, he said quietly. The cub lowered its head again. After a long moment of hesitation, it took a very small bite. Just a tiny piece. It chewed slowly, almost uncertainly, as if testing whether eating would somehow make the world collapse again. Nothing happened. The room remained quiet. The ranger remained still. Encouraged, the cub took another small bite, and then another. It didn't eat quickly, but it ate enough. Enough to remind its small body what survival felt like. Kido exhaled softly, relief washing through him. That's it, he whispered. Good. But even as the cub ate, it never moved far from the torn cloth. Each time it finished chewing, it would glance back toward the fabric, as though checking that it was still there. When it finished, the small portion of meat, the cub immediately returned to the cloth and curled beside it again. It pulled the fabric close with its front paws and rested its chin on top of it. Amina, who had quietly entered the room behind Kido, watched the scene thoughtfully. "That cloth is more than just an object to him," she said softly. Kido nodded. "It's the last piece of his world." Over the following days, the cub's strength began to return slowly. He started moving around the enclosure more often, exploring the corners cautiously, and occasionally stretching his thin limbs as if rediscovering what they could do. Sometimes he would even stop and watch Kido when the ranger entered the room. The distrust was still there, but curiosity had begun to replace pure fear. Despite this progress, one thing never changed. The cloth remained close, always. When the cub slept, he rested his head directly on top of it. When he ate, he dragged it beside the bowl with one paw. Even when he walked across the enclosure, he would glance back at the spot where the cloth lay. Amina observed the behavior carefully one afternoon while recording the cub's recovery notes. "He's anchoring himself to it," she said. Kido leaned against the wall nearby. "You mean emotionally?" Amina nodded. "It carries the scent of his mother and Daniel's blood. It's probably the only familiar thing he has left." Kido looked toward the cub, who was now lying quietly with the cloth beneath his chin. "If we take it away too soon, he said we could undo everything." Amina agreed. "For now," she said, "it stays." A few days later, the weather over the savanna began to shift. Strong winds swept across the plains in long gusts that rattled the windows of the ranger station. Outside, the tall grass bent low beneath the pressure of the wind, whispering constantly as it brushed against itself. Inside the enclosure, the cub had finally fallen into a deep sleep. His small body rose and fell steadily as he lay curled beside the cloth. The room felt calm, but the wind outside was growing stronger. A sudden gust pushed through a partially open window in the room. The air rushed across the floor. The torn piece of cloth lifted slightly. Then it slid across the dirt floor of the enclosure. Another gust followed. The cloth rolled again. The cub's ears twitched. His eyes snapped open. For a moment, he looked confused, blinking sleepily at the shifting fabric. Then the cloth lifted again and slid across the ground toward the mesh near the enclosure door. The cub sprang to his feet. In an instant, the fragile calm shattered. He rushed toward the cloth, letting out a thin cry. But before he could grab it, another gust pushed the fabric through a narrow gap beside the enclosure door. The cloth slipped halfway out. The cub lunged, claws scraping desperately against the ground. The cloth fluttered again. The cub began running frantically around the enclosure. He cried out in small, panicked sounds that echoed through the room. He clawed at the mesh. He pawed at the ground. He tried again and again to reach the cloth as the wind tugged it farther toward the door. Every movement of the fabric seemed to push the cub deeper into panic. Kido, one of the staff, shouted from down the hallway. By the time Kido reached the room, the enclosure was in chaos. The cub was running in tight circles, crying and clawing at the door. The cloth had nearly slipped completely outside. "Kido, the door," the staff member began. But it was too late. In his frantic attempts to reach the cloth, the cub had slammed repeatedly against the enclosure gate. The latch, which had not been fully secured after the morning feeding, gave way. The door popped open just enough for a desperate cub to squeeze through. The small lion burst out of the enclosure and bolted toward the open corridor. "Stop!" Kido shouted instinctively. But the cub was already gone. He raced through the open doorway of the building and disappeared into the tall grass behind the ranger station. By the time Kido reached the door, the cub had vanished. The savanna stretched wide and empty beyond the fence line. Then Kido noticed something else. The sky. Dark clouds were gathering rapidly along the western horizon. Within minutes, the wind intensified. The tall grass bent sharply beneath powerful gusts. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. "Storm," one of the rangers muttered. Lightning flickered far away. Then the rain came. Heavy drops slammed into the dry earth, releasing the sharp scent of wet dust. Within moments, the savanna was soaked beneath a sudden violent downpour. Kido grabbed his radio. "All units, we've got a missing cub," he said quickly. "Search teams out now." Several ranger vehicles roared to life. Flashlights sliced through the darkening rain as the search began. The storm intensified rapidly. Thunder cracked overhead. Rain poured down so heavily that visibility dropped to only a few meters in places. Kido drove slowly along the perimeter road, scanning the ground for any sign of the cub. But the rain was already washing away the tracks. He stopped the vehicle several times, stepping out into the mud to call into the darkness. "Easy, little one," he shouted over the wind. The savanna swallowed his voice. For hours the rangers searched. Flashlights moved through the tall grass and beneath the twisted shapes of acacia trees. But there was no sign of the cub. Kido felt a growing knot of fear tightening in his chest. If the cub had wandered too far into the open plains in this storm. He forced the thought away. Then sometime after midnight, Kido stopped his vehicle beside a cluster of acacia trees. The rain had softened slightly, though thunder still rolled in the distance. He turned off the engine. For a moment there was only the sound of wind and rain. Then he heard it. A faint sound. A whimper. At first he thought it was the wind, but then it came again. Thin, weak, fragile. Kido grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the mud. He moved slowly through the wet grass, listening carefully. "There you are," he murmured. The sound came from beneath a large acacia tree. Kido crouched and pushed aside the low branches. The flashlight beam caught a small shape, curled tightly beneath the exposed roots. The cub. He lay half buried in the mud, his body trembling violently from cold and exhaustion. Rain had soaked his fur completely, but clenched between his teeth was the torn piece of cloth. Kido knelt down slowly. "Hey," he whispered. The cub barely reacted. His eyes were half closed. Carefully, Kido slid his arms beneath the small body and lifted him from the mud. The cub didn't struggle. He was too tired. His small body simply sagged against Kido's chest. For the first time since they had met, the cub did not try to hide the cloth. Instead, he rested his head weakly against Kido's arm. Kido held him close beneath his jacket to shield him from the rain. "It's okay," he said quietly. The cub trembled once more. Then slowly, as the ranger carried him back through the storm toward the warm lights of the station, the little lion pressed his head against Kido's hand. And for the first time, he trusted him. By the time Kido carried the cub back through the gates of the Tsavo ranger station, the storm had begun to lose its fury. The rain was still falling, but softer now, tapping against the metal roof in a steady rhythm instead of the violent roar that had filled the night. Lights were already on inside the small veterinary building. Amina had been waiting. The moment the door burst open and Kido stepped inside, soaked from head to toe, she rushed forward. "You found him," Kido nodded, breathing heavily. He was under an acacia tree, barely moving. The cub hung weakly in his arms, mud clinging to his soaked fur. His body trembled with exhaustion and cold. But even now the torn piece of cloth was clenched carefully between his small front paws. Amina noticed it immediately. "He still has it," she said quietly. Wouldn't let go, Kido replied. The veterinary team moved quickly. Bring him here, Amina said, clearing space on the examination table. Kido gently laid the cub down. Under the bright light, the little lion looked even smaller than before. His fur was matted with mud, and his sides rose and fell rapidly with each breath. Amina grabbed a thick towel. Let's warm him up first. One of the staff members switched on a heat lamp above the table, bathing the cub in soft warmth. Amina began drying him carefully, working slowly from his head down his back. Mud streaked the towel as she wiped away the dirt. Temperature is low, she said, touching his ear. He's been out there too long. Kido stood nearby, watching quietly. The cub barely reacted as Amina worked. Exhaustion had drained nearly all his strength. But when Amina gently tried to shift the cloth away to dry his chest, the cub's paws tightened instantly. A weak growl escaped his throat. Amina stopped. All right, she murmured. You can keep it. She worked around the fabric instead. After several minutes of drying and warming, the cub's breathing began to steady slightly. Amina held a small syringe of water near his mouth. Easy, she whispered. The cub hesitated for a moment, then slowly lapped at the droplets. Good, she said softly. That's good. Gradually, the warmth of the room began to ease the trembling in his body. Once the examination was complete, they placed him back inside the enclosure with dry blankets. The cloth lay tucked carefully beneath his paws. That night, Kido did not go home. He pulled his chair beside the enclosure again and sat quietly watching the cub sleep beneath the heat lamp. Every now and then, the cub stirred and shifted slightly. But each time he would press his nose against the familiar cloth and settle again. Kido leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. You're safe now, he murmured. The days that followed were calmer. After the chaos of the storm, the ranger station returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Amina monitored the cub closely. Each morning she checked his pulse temperature and hydration levels while recording notes in a small notebook. He's stabilizing, she told Kido one afternoon. Slowly, he replied. The cub was still weak at first. For the first few days, he rarely moved beyond a small circle inside the enclosure. Most of his time was spent resting beside the cloth, but gradually strength returned. One morning, Kido arrived early and found the cub standing on unsteady legs near the fence. He was staring out through the metal bars toward the open savanna beyond the station. Kido stopped beside the enclosure. Thinking about going back out there, he asked quietly. The cub flicked an ear, but did not turn away from the view. Every morning and evening, Kido brought fresh food. At first, he would leave it and step away immediately. But over time, the cub stopped growling when he entered the room. Sometimes the little lion even watched him curiously as he placed the bowl down. Trust was growing slowly, but surely. After several weeks, Amina finally approached Kido with new plans. He's strong enough now, she said. Strong enough for what? For the training enclosure. Behind the ranger station was a small fenced area designed to help injured animals relearn natural behaviors before release. The space contained scattered logs, low rocks, and patches of grass that mimicked the savanna environment. The day the cub was moved there, he stepped cautiously out of the transport crate. The new space seemed enormous compared to the small recovery enclosure. For several minutes, he simply stood still, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, curiosity won. The cub padded forward. He approached a fallen log and sniffed it carefully. With a small burst of effort, he attempted to climb. His back paws slipped halfway up, and he tumbled back down. Kido chuckled softly from outside the fence. Not quite yet. But the cub tried again. This time he managed to scramble onto the log, though he wobbled slightly before finding his balance. Amina watched from the observation platform. "That's a good sign," she said. Over the next few days, the cub grew more confident. He explored every corner of the enclosure. He climbed rocks, stalked insects, hiding in the grass, and occasionally pounced on drifting leaves blown in by the wind. Each movement grew smoother, more controlled, more instinctive. "His hunting instincts are coming back," Amina said one morning. Kido nodded. "That's what we need." Throughout all of this, the torn piece of cloth remained inside the enclosure. At first, the cub still slept beside it every night. He would drag it carefully into whichever corner he chose for rest. But as the weeks passed, something began to change. The cub spent more time exploring, more time climbing and playing. Some days he barely glanced at the cloth for hours. Kido noticed the shift first. "He's letting go," he said quietly. Amina followed his gaze. The cloth lay in the shade near one corner of the enclosure. The cub was on the far side, chasing a grasshopper through the dirt. "That's part of healing," she said. "But we shouldn't rush it." So they left the cloth where it was. It remained a quiet reminder of where the cub had come from. One late afternoon, several weeks later, a ranger vehicle pulled into the station yard. 2 anti-poaching officers stepped out. Kido met them outside. "You found something?" he asked. One of the officers nodded solemnly. "We found Daniel." Kido's stomach tightened. "We're about 2 kilometers from the lioness." They explained what the patrol team had discovered earlier that day. Daniel's body had been hidden partially beneath thick grass, not far from the site where the lioness had been killed. The evidence at the scene confirmed what Kido had already suspected. Daniel had encountered the poachers while on patrol. He had attempted to intervene. During the confrontation, the poachers had turned their weapons on him. "He tried to stop them," the officer said quietly. Kido lowered his head. Later that evening, he and Amina stood near the enclosure, watching the cub move between the rocks. The sun was setting over the savanna, painting the sky in deep orange and gold. "So it's confirmed," Amina said softly. Kido nodded. Daniel tried to save that lioness. They both looked toward the cloth lying quietly near the fence. That piece of fabric, Amina said, slowly carried both of them. The lioness and Daniel. Kido watched the cub leap awkwardly onto a rock and balance there proudly. He saw everything Kido said. The gunfire, his mother falling, and Daniel trying to help. Amina folded her arms quietly. "That cloth wasn't just comfort," she said. "It was memory." Months passed. The cub continued to grow stronger and more confident. His once thin body filled out with healthy muscle. His movements became smooth and powerful. Finally, one morning, Amina closed her notebook and smiled. "He's ready." Kido looked up. "You're sure?" she nodded. "He can hunt insects, climb, and move confidently. His instincts are back." Kido took a long breath. "Then it's time." Early the next morning, Kido loaded the cub into a transport crate and drove toward a remote conservation area on the edge of Tsavo. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden light across the endless savanna. Tall grass swayed gently in the cool morning breeze. This was lion territory. Wild, untouched, perfect for a young lion beginning his life. Kido carried the crate to the edge of the grassland. He knelt beside it for a moment before opening the door. But first he reached into his bag. The torn piece of cloth lay folded in his hand. Kido placed it gently on the red earth in front of the crate door. Then he opened the gate. The cub stepped cautiously out, For the first time in months, there were no fences around him. No walls, only open savanna stretching endlessly in every direction. The cub paused when he saw the cloth. He stepped closer and lowered his head to sniff it. For a long moment, he simply stood there. The morning wind moved softly through the grass. Kido waited silently behind him. Finally, the cub lifted his head. He looked once toward Kido, then toward the open savanna. Slowly, he stepped forward, past the cloth, into the tall grass. Within seconds, his golden fur blended with the landscape. And then he was gone. Kido remained standing there for a long time. The cloth lay quietly on the red earth beside him. The wind lifted its edges slightly before letting it settle again. The cub had carried the memory of that cloth for months. But now he no longer needed it to keep moving forward. Somewhere out in the vast savanna of Tsavo, a young lion was beginning his life again. 2 years passed. Time moved across Tsavoawa the way it always had, without mercy and without pause. The land remained as vast and unforgiving as ever, shaped by long, dry season sudden storms and the constant struggle for survival that defined every creature living beneath its endless sky. Ranger Kido Mwangji still patrolled the same roads and acacia flats, where so much had changed his life. He still drove the dusty perimeter trails at dawn and at dusk. He still checked old poaching routes, watched the horizon for smoke, and listened for the warning signs that the savanna always offered to those who knew how to read it. And sometimes, when his patrol took him near the stretch of land where he had once found a trembling lion cub in the middle of the road, he would slow down without meaning to. He would look out over the tall grass and remember the weak growls, the torn piece of cloth, the storm, the way the cub had finally rested his head against Kido's hand. He never spoke of it much anymore. Not because he had forgotten, but because some stories settled so deeply into a person that words seemed too small to hold them. Over those 2 years, trap cameras placed around parts of Tsavo had occasionally captured images of a young male lion moving through the area. He was not yet fully mature, but strong enough now to travel alone. Sometimes he appeared at the edge of a waterhole just before sunrise. Sometimes he was seen shadowing impala herds from a distance. Once a ranger reviewing night footage spotted him standing on a low rise while a group of hyenas passed below. "He's a solitary one," Amina had once said, studying one of the grainy camera images pinned to the station board. A young male finding his territory, Kido had answered. That was the most reasonable explanation. Lions moved, split-fought, wandered. A young male on his own was not unusual. Still, something about the animal always pulled at Kido's attention. Maybe it was only memory trying to turn every distant shadow into something personal. Or maybe it was something else. Then late one afternoon, the past returned. The message came through Kido's radio while he was finishing a patrol along the southern ridge. Unidentified tire tracks near the old acacia cluster, one of the rangers reported. Same zone where the lioness was found 2 years ago. Kido's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. Any visual confirmation? Negative. Just tracks. Fresh. Fresh was enough. That part of Tsavo had been quiet for months, but poachers rarely stayed gone forever. They learned the land the way rangers did. They waited for habits to settle. Then they came back. "I'm heading there now," Kido replied. He turned the vehicle at once and drove toward the acacia flats, keeping one eye on the road and the other on the shifting colors of the late afternoon sky. The sun had begun its slow descent, laying bronze light across the savanna. The air felt strangely still, too still. As he moved deeper into the area, he noticed the antelope first. A small herd of impala crossed ahead of him at a fast, nervous pace, not grazing, not pausing, just moving. Kido narrowed his eyes. Animals always knew before people did. The savanna near sunset usually carried its own steady rhythm, birds, settling insects, rising distant movement in the grass. But now, the silence felt pressed flat, unnatural, as if the land itself were holding its breath. When he reached the edge of the acacia cluster, he slowed immediately. There, half hidden behind thorn brush and dry grass, sat a pickup truck without license plates. Kido killed the engine at once. Dust drifted past the windshield and slowly settled. For a moment, he stayed still, studying the truck through the fading light. The vehicle was angled for a quick exit, its rear partly concealed by brush. That alone told him enough. Poachers. He reached for his radio. "Savo station, this is Kido," he said in a low voice. "I've got an unmarked pickup at the old acacia site. Possible armed poachers. I'm requesting backup." Static crackled, then a broken burst of sound. He adjusted the radio and tried again. Repeat, possible armed. The signal dissolved into noise. The terrain here often interfered with the radio once the sun dropped low. Kido swore under his breath and tried changing frequency, but the response came back weak and fragmented. Not good. He opened the door carefully and stepped down from the patrol vehicle, moving slowly, keeping the truck between himself and the hidden pickup for partial cover. He had just taken 2 steps forward when movement flashed near the other vehicle. 2 men emerged from behind it. Both carried rifles. They saw him instantly. The taller one raised his weapon halfway. "Well, look what we've got," he said. Kido stopped. The second man moved slightly to the side, not quite circling, but enough to widen the angle and make it clear they were thinking about it. Kido kept his hands visible and his voice level. "This is protected land," he said. "You know that." The taller man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "And you know you should have stayed in your truck." Kido's pulse thudded once in his throat, but his face did not change. "Backup is already on the way." A lie or half a lie, but it was worth trying. The second man gave a short laugh. "Out here," he said. "Nobody hears anything out here." The first one lifted his rifle a little higher. Nobody helps either. The air between them tightened. Kido measured the distance. Too far to disarm, too exposed to run cleanly. He shifted 1 foot back very slightly, keeping his body loose. He had been in dangerous situations before. Rangers in Savo always were sooner or later. But this felt sharper somehow, more personal. The old acacia site, the same ground, the same kind of men. The taller poacher took a step forward. "You rangers never learn," he said. And then the savanna answered. A roar exploded from the tall grass behind Kido. It was not the thin cry of a cub, not the uncertain sound of a frightened animal. It was deep, powerful, and full-bodied, a roar that seemed to tear through the evening air and shake the silence apart. All 3 men froze. The second poacher turned first. What was that? Another roar came closer this time. Grass parted. A lion stepped out. He was young, but no longer young in the helpless way of cubhood. He was large now, heavy-shouldered, his coat a dark, rich gold in the fading light. A roughening mane framed his head and neck, not yet the full weight of an older male, but enough to make him imposing. His muscles shifted beneath his hide with each step. His eyes were fixed, sharp, alert. And he was standing between Kido and the poachers. The lion stopped and let out another roar louder than before. The sound rolled across the acacia flats and struck the men like a physical force. The second poacher stumbled backward. "Shoot it," he snapped. But the taller man hesitated. The lion took 1 more deliberate step forward. Not rushing, not charging. Warning. His head was low. His shoulders were squared. His gaze never left the armed men. The taller poacher lifted his rifle, but only halfway. His nerve had already begun to break. This was no trapped animal, no wounded lioness cornered by gunfire. This was a healthy young male, close enough now that one mistake could become a death sentence. The lion roared again. That did it. "Move," the second man shouted. Both poachers backed toward the truck in a scramble of panic and dust. One nearly dropped his rifle climbing into the cab. The engine roared to life. Tires spun against the dirt, throwing up a red cloud as the pickup lurched away from the acacia cluster and vanished toward the western track. Then, just like that, they were gone. The dust drifted slowly back to the ground. The savanna fell silent again. Only the lion remained. Kido stood very still. He knew better than to mistake one danger for the end of all danger. A lion, even one that had just driven off armed men, was still a lion. Wild, powerful, unpredictable. The animal did not immediately move. He simply stood there looking at Kido. The ranger let his breathing settle. He did not reach for anything. He did not step forward. He did not look away too quickly either. The evening wind stirred the grass between them. Then the lion began to approach. One step, then another. His movement was calm, measured, almost deliberate in a way that made Kido's skin prickle. The lion was not stalking him. He was studying him. Kido's heart hammered harder now, not from the poachers anymore, but from something stranger. Something he could not yet name. The lion came within several yards and stopped. The fading light caught his front leg. Kido's eyes narrowed. There, just above the paw, half hidden beneath the fur, was a small scar. A thin, pale line. On the same leg that had been scraped when a terrified cub twisted against the rescue net 2 years ago. Kido stared. No, it couldn't be. The lion tilted his head very slightly. The gesture was so familiar, it felt like a hand reaching directly into Kido's memory. The cub had used to do that from inside the enclosure whenever Kido spoke in a low voice, head-tipped eyes fixed, as if listening for meaning beneath the sound. Kido's throat went dry. He looked again at the scar, at the eyes, at the strange stillness between them. "It can't be," he whispered. The lion remained motionless for another few seconds, the wind moving faintly through the darker fur around his neck. Then he began to walk, not away, but around Kido in a slow circle, as if checking him from every angle. Kido did not turn sharply. He let the movement happen, his eyes tracking carefully. The lion completed the circle and stopped in front of him again now, only a few feet away. Close enough for certainty. Close enough that Kido could see the small notch at one ear, the old healed line on the foreleg, the same steady alertness in the eyes that had once belonged to a starving cub trembling over a torn piece of cloth. And in that suspended moment, Kido knew. This was him, the cub from the road, the cub from the storm, the cub who had once believed the whole world wanted to steal the last thing he had left. Now he stood full-grown in the grasslands of Tsavo, strong and wild and entirely his own. Kido let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The lion looked at him without fear. Not tame, never that, but not afraid. There was recognition there, not the simple kind humans assign too easily, but something older and quieter. A pause in the wild, a moment of memory. Kido almost smiled, though his eyes stung unexpectedly. "You," he said softly. The lion blinked once. Then just as calmly as he had appeared, he turned. He walked back toward the tall grass, each step unhurried, each movement controlled. After a few yards, he stopped and glanced back over his shoulder. The light was nearly gone now, with the western sky burning orange behind him. His face was still composed, powerful. No fear, no helplessness, No trace of the crying cub, except in the memory Kido carried. Then he turned again and disappeared into the high gold grass. The savanna swallowed him whole. Kido remained where he was unable to move for several seconds. The silence around him felt different now, not empty, but full. His pulse still pounded from the confrontation, from the poachers, from the impossible recognition of what had just happened. Slowly, a small smile touched his face. He looked toward the place where the lion had vanished and spoke into the quiet evening air. "You didn't forget, did you?" No answer came unless the soft hiss of wind through the grass counted as one. Eventually, Kido walked back to his patrol vehicle. The sun was sinking below the horizon now, stretching long bands of amber across the plains. In the distance, antelope moved carefully through the fading light, their silhouettes dark against the yellow savanna. Somewhere beyond the grass, a young lion walked free. Not the broken cub Kido had once carried through a storm. Not the frightened little creature who had clung to a blood-stained piece of cloth because it was all he had left of love and loss and memory. This lion belonged to the land now, to the wind, to the wide and merciless beauty of Tsavo. But something of the past had remained. Maybe not in words, maybe not in human understanding. Yet somehow, in the deep and hidden place where instinct meets memory, something had endured. Kido sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. He thought of Daniel, of the lioness, of the cloth left on the red earth the day the cub had walked away into the wild. He thought of all the lives that had touched one another in one brutal corner of the savanna, and how 2 years later the story had returned, not with grief, but with proof that compassion sometimes leaves a mark deeper than fear. Then he started the truck and turned it toward the ranger station. Behind him, the sky darkened over Tsavo. Ahead of him, the road glowed red in the last light of day. And somewhere out there, hidden among the tall grass and acacia shadows, a lion walked on. Wild, alive, and remembered. Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel and supporting more stories like this. Your support helps us share powerful wildlife moments and continue bringing meaningful rescue stories from the wild to you.